Today was a bad day. I had a pretty crappy day today. Two women, who were quite rude, stayed past closing where I work, so I missed the bus that would take me to the bus station. My home is a few miles walk from my place, which I can normally do pretty easily, but not when it's 90 degrees outside. So I tried to walk to the bus station, and ended up getting there just as my bus home was leaving. I ran after it, only to fall on the pavement. I managed to skin both of my knees and scrape up my arm during the fall. It hurt. The next bus wouldn't come for another half hour, and I was upset and tired. I know it's childish, but I cried. I called a friend who lives nearby and has a car, but she didn't answer, and I did not want to make that walk while bleeding and sobbing at the same time. So I sat on one of the benches and cried. People ignored me, which I expected, except for one man, sitting a bit away. He was maybe mid-50s, and was staring at me with his huge grin. I tried to ignore him, since I've had my fair share of creeps at bus stations. There was a period where there were no buses in the station, meaning no one was at the station. It was just him and I was still crying at that point. He decided to take out his phone and, without hiding it, start taking photos of me sobbing with my knees both bloody messes. I'm horrible with scary situations, so I froze up and tried to act like he didn't exist. A bus came a few minutes later and he put his phone away, winked at me, and got on the bus. I feel gross and freaked out. Creepy old guy. Let's not meet. Grave robbing an infant? Let's not meet. Let me start off by saying that as I write this, it's late at night. I just got off, working a long night, and I've had a couple drinks, so I'm ready to relate the creepiest story that's ever happened to me to the best of my abilities. A few years ago, I don't remember how many now, let's just say I was in my early 20s, so that would put this story between 2008 to 2010. I was out camping with some friends in Charles C. Dean Wilderness in the Hoosier National Forest. The main road in the wilderness is named Tower Ridge Road, after the tall Hickory Ridge fire tower that is smack dab in the middle of the woods. When you pull off of the road into the parking area for the tower, there is an old disused gravel road which leads to a few trails out in the wilderness. At the very end of the road is a very old cemetery. A lot of the headstones are simple sandstone markers indicating that someone is buried there. If there was any information on them to begin with, it had long since eroded away. The area that made up the wilderness was created when the government repossessed farmers' land during the Great Depression. Before that, the area was farmed for quite a while, so naturally the poor, subsistence farming people that lived and farmed the area needed a place to bury their loved ones. Most of the graves in the cemetery were very old, and all their immediate relatives had long since passed away themselves. However, there are a few granite headstones from as early as the mid-1990s, and a few from wealthier former residences who were able to afford professionally carved headstones dating from the early 20th century. I was camping in a convenient area with close proximity to our vehicle and the gravel road to make our camping trip all the more comfortable as well. The only downside to having all these conveniences was that we had to be near the main trail, so we had a fair amount of foot traffic going by our tents. My friends and myself were friendly to everybody passing by, exchanging pleasantries, and wishing people a good hike. Quite a while after dark had settled in, when we had our fire roaring, and we were all in good spirits after having some drinks and smoking some pot, a person of average build and weight passed our camp, wearing a headlamp with a creepy red filter so we couldn't see his face, and he carrying a spade with a D-grip. We said hello, like we had to everybody that passed by our camp, but this person was different. This person just passed on by without breaking his stride or saying a word to us. He just acted like we weren't even there. We all thought this was weird, but nobody said anything to each other, and we soon forgot about our encounter with a weird shovel-wielding man. The next morning, I awoke to a beautiful blue sky. The birds themselves were singing beautifully in the wind, and it was shaping up to be a truly beautiful day. I woke up before my compatriots, which wasn't unusual for me. I'm always the first one up in the morning on camping trips. I usually get coffee ready and wake everybody up with the sounds and smells of coffee being made. On this particular trip, being a bunch of 20-year-olds, We remembered the booze and weed, but of course forgot the coffee. After standing around for a while and not wanting to wake my friends up, I decided to take the mile or so hike down this used gravel road and check out the cemetery. I left without telling anyone where I was going. After all, it was a beautiful day. Not too hot, not too cold, the sun was shining. What could possibly go wrong, right? I had soon made the mile or so trek down the gravel road, enjoying the sights and smells of the forest, and I quickly found the cemetery. It was surrounded by a waist-high chain-link fence with a gate in it. I opened the gate and stepped inside the cemetery and began looking at the graves. Near the entrance to the cemetery, there were a few professionally carved limestone headstones. As I approached the closest one, to my horror, I saw that the grave had been disturbed. There was an approximately 5-foot hole dug near the headstone, with the same D-grip shovel in the bottom of the hole, which was located in the approximate location where the person would have been buried. The hole even had 3 terrace-like steps dug into it, so the grave robber could easily get out of their own hole when they were done doing their dastardly deed. I inspected the headstone as best as I could under the circumstances. It was limestone and very old, so a lot of the information had long since eroded away. However, I am fairly certain that the grave belonged to what I think is an infant girl named Elizabeth, who died shortly after her birth in the early 20th century. After my brief inspection, the notion dawned on me that there was only one way in and out of the cemetery, and I hadn't passed anyone on my way in. I wasn't trying to be stealthy in my approach, and I soon realized that the person who dug the hole probably heard me coming and was probably still in the immediate area. All of a sudden, I had the feeling that I was being watched from somewhere in the surrounding forests, and needless to say, I felt very unnerved by the whole situation. I looked around, but I saw nothing but the endless forest on either side of me. I decided to beat a hasty retreat from the area. After I got out of the eyeshot of the cemetery, I walked, as fast as I could, back to the relative safety of our camp. A little while after I got back to camp, my friends started waking up, and naturally, I relayed what had just happened to them. They were just as freaked out by the whole situation as I was. After some discussion, we decided to leave. After we had packed up camp and were about to leave the parking area, we noticed that there was a sign on the gate of the gravel road going to the cemetery indicating a number for whoever managed the cemetery. Of course, we called the number, and I relayed my story to whoever was on the other end. A few hours after this, I received a call from the Lawrence County Sheriff's Office asking for my story. They said they would send an officer to check out the cemetery. Needless to say, I never heard back from them, but I sure as hell hope that I never run into the D-handled shovel-wielding weirdo who would dig up an infant's grave in the middle of the night. Postscript. I have no idea what the guy could have been after. The area where the cemetery is located is very remote today, and back in the early 20th century, it would have been even more remote. I would imagine that most people would have just been buried in a simple home, made unsealed wooden coffin with no embalming. They probably would have just had the local priest over to say a few words, and that would have been that. Later on, they probably paid to have a nice headstone made on this particular grave for their precious, crying daughter. I've been back to this particular area of the woods many times since then. I've been back up to the cemetery in the years since this incident. You can no longer tell that a grave had ever been disturbed. I'm pretty sure I know which one it was, but it's hard to be 100% sure. I've never had another experience that even comes close to this one. A lot of the graves have sunken in due to time causing the caskets to collapse further, confusing which grave it could have been. All I can hope is that poor Elizabeth is able to spend the rest of eternity in peace. Mental breakdowns due to my vice principal. Wow, okay. So this is a story I'm sharing, I guess. I can't put flair because I'm on mobile, but I hope you can get past that, sorry. This happened over the course of grade 6, 7, and half of grade 8. If you want more details on a certain part, let me know and I'd be happy to share them, but for now, this is the story of my probably mentally unstable vice principal, Chap. Entering grade 6, I was excited to be in the same school as my older sister, Jean, because it had been a few years. Her friend Loser had started a school curling team, and I wanted to be on it with Jean since I heard about it. The coach of our team was Chap. I mostly had no problems with Chap for a while, besides insisting she knew the rules of the game. When she didn't really bother us. One day, we went to a tournament as a team in another town. It was an overnight field trip for about 4 days, where teams from schools all across my province competed against each other. Yes, province. If you couldn't already tell by the fact I was playing curling, I'm Canadian. We had a great winning streak for the first half of the tournament, but then one game in particular, we were losing. Bad. After the game, Chap pulled the team to the side and said to us, "Don't talk to anyone about curling until our next game. It'll put you in a better mindset." I have no idea what her logic was, but Jean and I went along with it. When my mom asked us how our game went, we said we weren't allowed to tell her because Chap said so. She was kind of ticked off. She went to Chap and told her that it's against the school board rules to say stuff like that, and she was to get fired if she ever continued doing that. And thus, the tension between her and my family begins. Nothing really big happened until we made it to the finals. We had a schedule to switch out people with a spare because it is a school team and everyone has to be equal, blah blah blah. So basically I was in every single game until this point, and then Chap told me it was my turn to rotate out on the final game. The reason was significant because I was the vice. At the time that meant generally I was second best, and this was the final game. Loser, who was a skip, first in hierarchy, was telling her he didn't think he could play without me, but Chap wouldn't listen. So my mom bribed my older sister to fake sick so that the spare would take her place instead. Please bear with me here, it gets much worse over the years than taking me out of the final game. Next year, I still wanted to be on the team. I was the one and only surviving member of the team the year before. 3 people, including Jean, went on to high school, and the spare moved away. I was sure I would get to be skipped this year, but no. Chap chose someone with 2 years less experience than me, and once again put me as vice. However, I was still excited because this year, there was a poster competition. I'm an art kid, so this was like being given $100, especially since the posters were going to be on TV. I talked to the other team members and came up with a design, then made it a reality. I showed it to Chap, and then left it in the office overnight. I was sick the next day, but came back the day after. My friend, who was on the curling team as well, which stopped me in the halls. She looked at me sadly and asked if I knew what happened. I didn't know, so I asked her what it was. She then told me that Chap had decided the day I was sick that she didn't like the poster. She wanted to keep certain elements though, so she cut the pieces that she liked out and glued them on her own poster, and on top of that, asked how I drew my flowers, so she could draw hers the same way. I left school early that day, crying. At the next practice, Chap had brought out 2 of the team members from the year before who went to high school to help coach us. Jean wasn't one of them. Turns out she had sent all the team members who went on to high school an invite to coach, except for Jean. Jean was really upset about that, but this is far from the worst she's done. Sick and tired of this, I talked to some of my curling friends from the school. There was just enough of us to form a team, so we planned that grade 8 would be our year. Grade 8 we would make our own team and enter the competition because it wasn't against the rules to not be an official school team. So grade 8 rolled around and I was pumped, and 2 of my other school curling friends, God and Flake, were forming a team with me. I had even switched curling clubs to be able to practice with them. Then the curling season rolled around. Chap had offered me the position of skip this year, but I already knew I was going to be on another team, free from her grasp. So I asked my mom to be here with us. Because of school rules, she had to comply. My mom arrived and we told her we were forming a team with Witch, Flake, and Gone. She was actually okay with us and told us we were free to do what we wanted, so we left. That night was the most catastrophic night of the year. We were receiving emails from Witch, Flake, and Gone's parents, resigning them from the team. They told us we were on our own because Chap had told them she didn't approve of the team. I suspect there was more to that, but I still don't know if that's true. Point is, I was all alone now. It sucked because nobody believed my mom and I of what she said. I felt so alone and helpless. Then I started to get paranoid thoughts. She ruined my team. What else could she do to me? Could she ruin my school career? This hit me hard because it was about 2 weeks before I was supposed to do an audition for the most highly regarded arts high school in my province. Could she mess it all up as well? I started to cry myself to sleep just thinking about seeing her, not getting into the school, everything that happened, and then I found out my thoughts weren't too paranoid after all. I was just looking in the wrong place. My mom got a call the next day after I reluctantly gone to school and cried in classes quite often. It was from the organizers of the tournament. They said I wasn't allowed to compete in the tournament this year because Chap told me she was placing a hold over me and it would stay in effect unless I changed schools, which by the way, she isn't allowed to do stuff like that, but the people didn't know that. I didn't go to school the next 2 weeks. When I did go back to school, it wasn't back to that school, it was to a new school. There I formed a new curling team with mostly first-year curlers, which I managed to lead. I skipped all the way to the finals, and although we lost, we still beat my old school's team with which Flake gone and some other girl. Before I changed schools though, I told my gym teacher about everything and it turned out she had a pretty high position in the board, and he managed to get her transferred to a school in a different city. So, Vice Principal Chap, if you're reading this, you know who you are, and who I am. Let's please never meet again. Thank you very much. The man in my driveway. In order to tell my horror story, I have to preface it with another tale of horror that is not exactly creepy, but no less terrifying. In July of 2012, I just returned from a work trip to New York City, where I lived at the time, when I got a call from my aunt telling me my childhood home, which my parents and sisters still lived in, had inexplicably burned to the ground. Luckily, no one was home when the fire started, but in minutes, the entire house was up in flames, and in hours, all our worldly possessions and memories were burnt to a crisp. Investigators determined that the fire somehow started in the garage, but to this day, the underlying cause is still a mystery. Fast forward to several months later, when I'm still grieving this unimaginable loss, but in a place of more or less acceptance of what had happened, my husband, boyfriend at the time, and I were back in my hometown for a weekend escape from the city. My parents were renting a house one town over, and we visited them frequently in an effort to be together and there for each other after such a tragic loss. My husband and I had gone out to dinner and decided to drive by our ruins of my childhood home in an effort to bring some closure to what had been a long, painful ordeal. I thought that seeing what was left of the debris, the ghosts of my childhood memories, might help me move on. It was about 10 o'clock in the evening when we turned our car down towards my old street. My house was set in the suburbs of Connecticut in a quiet beach town of only 10,000 people. My neighborhood was not very populated, and certainly not one you would frequently, if ever, see someone walking around, especially at nighttime. But as we turned onto my street, I saw a man in the distance, walking down my street. I thought the size of him was odd for the reasons I just said. There was nowhere to really take a stroll into this neighborhood, and I can't remember ever seeing anyone just walking aimlessly on my street at nighttime. When I saw him, I told my husband to lock the car doors, apologized for my paranoia, but wanted to take the precautions just in case. He laughed at my propensity to scare easily, but nevertheless obliged me. I forgot about the man as we drove up the hill of my driveway, parked the car, and stared in disbelief at the wreckage before us. There was nothing left of my childhood home but some burnt wood that once held up my house and provided the foundation for the place I spent the first 18 years of my life. A tear streamed down my face as I gazed at the ruins, unable to even speak. It was then I noticed a flicker of movement in the corner of my eye. I turned to head to the right and saw, to my horror, the same man I saw walking down the street in the distance, only about 6 feet away from my window, staring into the car. He had walked all the way up the driveway to where our car was. There was no chance he just lost his way. I will never forget the look in his eyes, vacant in a way, yet also filled with some kind of intense craze, like he was about to do something that I'm glad I will never know what. I immediately began screaming my head off, imploring my husband to drive away as fast as he could. My husband put the car in reverse and sped down the driveway. I remember hearing the screech of the wheels, which sound like they do in the movies when someone's trying to get away fast. When we got to the bottom of the hill, and my husband moved the car from reverse to drive, I looked back out my window and saw the men sprinting down the driveway towards us. I started screaming again, begging my husband to drive. I turned my head as we flew down the street and saw that he continued to chase us on foot, but being that we were in a car, we lost him quickly. I never reported the incident, and I have no idea who this man was or what he wanted from us. My husband believes I overreacted, and that the man simply saw how scared I was and decided to fuck with us. That still doesn't explain why he would walk up the hill in the first place and just stare into our car, and like I said, the look on his face was not a benevolent one, but unquestionably nefarious. So much for getting the closure I was so desperately wanting and needed after the fire. I haven't been back to this house since that experience, and maybe in a way that man, whoever he was and whatever his intentions were, helped me move on, because I never looked back down that road again.